We all love the Souls games because of their immaculate art style, bosses, level design. Okay, look, we get it. You read the title. We already know what the video is going to be about. I'm going to be ranking all the Souls games using simple basic math and this chart to see which one is truly the best. I'm going to be ranking them based on art style, combat, level design, bosses, story, / lore. Each of these categories are worth 10 points, meaning if a game gets all 10 for all categories, it gets a maximum total of 50 points. So I already know a lot of people are going to get mad either way, so without wasting any more of your time, let's get right into the video. Also, this is just my opinion, maybe, I don't know, just watch the video, please. Let's start with Demon Souls. Demon Souls in terms of art style and atmosphere gets a 7 for me. Now me personally, I think a 7 is a good rating, but to some people it might seem a bit odd not giving it an 8 or higher. Here's the thing, while I like the art direction of the game, there wasn't anything in it that made me go wow. The enemies and bosses look cool, but they look like something you would see in other dark fantasy settings. The environment looks decent, especially on the PS5 version, but again, it's just your generic castles and grey corridors. Nothing too crazy. Now in terms of combat, the game only gets a 5 from me. The combat of Demon Souls is good as it paved the way for the future Souls games, but judging it by itself, it's pretty slow and a bit mediocre. I know a lot of people probably love that slower methodical pace, but I think that they could have at least made the weapons a bit more fun to use. The weapons in the game have no special attacks. You just get a sword, swing it around, and that's it. Thankfully this is something that the later games improved on, but in Demon Souls it's an issue. Let's move on to level design. The levels in this game are very linear, which for me isn't really a problem as sometimes I like jumping back into linear style of games instead of open worlds, but the levels here, while beautiful, especially on the PS5 version, as I said before, this relates back to art style, they look a bit generic. Now don't get me wrong, some areas like Shrine of Storms and the upper later level area of World 2 looks really cool and unique, and even some parts of Boletaria Kingdom itself. But the rest of the game just has this really dull looking levels. Another thing I hated about the levels is how narrow the pathways are, and the abundance of enemies in these areas. I swear every corner is filled with an annoying enemy and it wouldn't be an issue if the game wasn't so narrow. I swear using a great or colossal sword in this game is a recipe for disaster due to how tight the level design is. For these reasons, I'm gonna have to give the level design of this game a 5. Now let's talk about the bosses. The bosses in Demon Souls also gets a 5, due to around 95% of them being mediocre in terms of mechanics and quality. A lot of the boss encounters in the game felt like gimmicks, and while some gimmick fights can be fun, most of the times they end up failing at that. Now in terms of designs, they do look cool, but again, they're really gimmicky. There's some exceptions like Flame Lurker, King Alon, Penetrator, as those bosses are really good, but the rest were just mid. And finally, we have story and lore. Demon Souls is set in Boletaria, a kingdom consumed by a dark being called the Old One. Following its release, through the use of forbidden soul arts, players take on the role of a hero brought to Boletaria to kill its fallen king Alant and pacify the Old One. Personally, I'm gonna give it a 7, as while the story isn't upfront, the lore is a bit interesting. I don't want to spoil anything major as most people haven't played Demon Souls, but yeah, the lore is pretty decent. It's not as deep as the other Souls games, but deep enough to make you curious on what's going on in the world. So in total, Demon Souls gets 29 points out of 50. Next up on the list, we have Dark Souls 2. Let's start with art style and atmosphere. The whole vibe of Dark Souls 2 gets an 8 from me, as just like Dark Souls 1, I really like the look of the game, even though Dark Souls 1 had better looking areas. Dark Souls 2 had places that were visually pleasing to look at, areas such as the Iron Keep, Shrine of Amana, the forest, and the castle. All of those areas look nice and different from one another, and even the levels that weren't super interesting to me still had a cooler design and layout compared to those of Demon Souls. The only thing holding back the art and atmosphere is the graphics. Now in terms of combat, the game gets a 6 from me. I wanted to give it a 5, but the only reason why I didn't is because at least it has omnidirectional rolling compared to Dark Souls 1. But other than that, the combat is really slow, even slower than Dark Souls 1. Your character also feels floaty and heavy, which makes it feel a bit clunky at times whenever you're in an encounter. The healing speed is frustratingly slow, and dodging is now tied to ADP, which you have to level up or your character will take damage on dodges you thought you rolled through perfectly. But hey, at least you can power stance. But even that has an issue, as 2 swings from power stancing can deplete your entire stamina. So yeah, combat is really sluggish and just not all that fun, at least to me. Now when it comes on to level design, Dark Souls 2 gets a 5. Now most levels in terms of visuals, yeah sure, most of them look really gray, but I think that has to do with graphics, as some levels like outside the castle looks really nice. The game also doesn't feel super linear, which I really appreciate. However, it has some weird issues with connecting levels. For example, traveling from the forest to the castle. In the forest, everything looks pretty dry, and sure, it looks like it's about to rain, but there's no rain. But as soon as you go through the passage, on the other side, it's all of a sudden raining, and it looks like nighttime. And I know a lot of people say that time is convoluted in Dark Souls, which is true, but I think they could have made this flow better. The same thing for the elevator to the Iron Keep. The area before the Iron Keep is just a regular town or village, and when you look into the sky, there's no fortress to be found. But when you go through the level and then go up the elevator, you stumble upon the Iron Keep, and geographically, it makes zero friggin' sense. Okay, apart from that, what about the enemy placements? Well, it's dog shit. Man, I swear, every single area of this game has around 3 enemies in corners waiting to jump you. The amount of enemies that's in the levels are genuinely surprising, and even after clearing a room filled with them, 2 minutes later another will just walk right in. And it's not like the game has respawning enemies or anything, it's just that there are so many of them that one probably got aggroed from afar away. But that's not even the worst, as the game has these statues where you need branches in order to get past them. Mind you, these branches are very rare and to my knowledge have limited amounts in each game cycle. Most of the areas here aren't super important, but it just makes level design a bit aggravating. One thing I do like though is the bonfire aesthetic system. This allows you to go into different new game cycles for a specific area, which means you can refight bosses and get equipment locked behind new game. I think that's pretty cool. Now bosses gets a 4, as quality wise they're very boring, and in terms of their art style or art direction, whatever you want to call it, they look very dull and mid. The only ones I like fighting because they are great in terms of both quality and art design are Fume Knight, Surulon, and Looking Glass Knight. There's some other ones that have cool designs, but they are really mediocre encounters. The story and lore of the game gets an 8. I think it's pretty decent. My personal favorite is the one with Nashandra and Vendrick, and how she used him and how he locked himself away to prevent her from gaining more power. I don't know, I just like that mini story. So in total, Dark Souls 2 has 31 points, which is pretty average. Now let's move on to Dark Souls 1. The atmosphere of this game gets a 9. I don't know, there's just something oddly calm about Dark Souls 1. Sure, there are mutated monsters running around, but the game just feels, again, calming. I also like how even though the game is dark fantasy, it doesn't have the typical look. Like, you're not seeing girls walking around with bikini armor plates or orcs, elves, or some other shit like that, which will definitely draw in some players who aren't really a big fan of stuff like that, like how I was when I was younger. Now over the years I've grown to like those type of stuff, except bikini armor. I don't mind sexy armor in games, but stuff like this just doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. Overall, the art style and atmosphere is just really cool and the vibes is just immaculate. Combat of Dark Souls 1 gets a 5, and that's mostly because of the lack of omnidirectional rolling. I've went into why I don't like this in my other video, which you should check out if you want. But basically in Dark Souls 1, you can't dodge in any direction when locked on. You can only go to 4 directions, which makes combat feel really awkward and, to be honest, much more enjoyable without lock on. The weapons also feel a bit samey as there are only a couple with unique special attacks, but that's it for combat. Despite those things, I do like how at least it feels a slightly bit smoother than Dark Souls 2. Even though Dark Souls 2 has omnidirectional rolling, which gives it an edge. The level design of the game is great, and it's one of the things people always praise about it, especially in the earlier ones. You see, while Dark Souls 1 is an open world, it is interconnected, which means that the levels oftentimes lead back to each other. I like this approach to level design as it makes it feel like you're traversing in a large setting even if the game is an open world. The enemies in the levels are spread out enough to not to overwhelm the player, unlike Dark Souls 2. However, there are some areas in the early game that sucks. For example, Blighttown and New Londo Ruins, but everywhere else is great. Now, a lot of people tend to say that the late game areas like Anor Londo, Lost Izalith, Duke's Archives are bad, or at least not as fun to explore as the early game, mostly because of the lack of interconnectivity. I understand where people are coming from and they are entitled to their own opinions, but me personally, I never had an issue with the lack of interconnectivity in those areas, especially since I think that having the Lord Vessel made things better compared to always running back miles just to find a specific area. All in all, I would give the level design of Dark Souls 1 an 8. The bosses on the other hand gets a 6, as while there are some cool bosses like ONS, Quelaag, Artorias, Sith, and Gwen, the rest felt a bit boring, average, or outright terrible. But one thing I do like is that while the bosses were mid, At least the designs looked really cool. Now the story and lore gets a 9, as finding out the origins of the entire world and how all of this started because one man found a special flame and was granted powers, it was pretty interesting. Overall, Dark Souls 1 gets 37 points out of 50, which is pretty impressive. Dark Souls 3. The art style and atmosphere of Dark Souls 3 gets a 9, as the world looked interesting enough to make me want to continue and play. I know in the earlier levels the game tends to look a bit brown and gray, but in the mid to late game in the DLCs, the areas tend to look really nice. The combat is also great, and the addition of weapon arts give each weapons more uniqueness to them, and because of this it gets an 8. The level design gets a 7 from me, and personally a 7 as a rating isn't bad at all. You see, a lot of people would say that the weakest part of Dark Souls 3 is the linearity of the levels, and while I do agree it's the weakest part of the game, Bloodborne feels the exact same way, yet not a lot of people complain about it. But the linear style isn't something I hate, as you can't get lost, and in terms of enemy placement, the game does a good job at that, as there were barely any time where I felt overwhelmed by mobs. The bosses in the game gets a 10, and I know some people are confused why, but hear me out. Sure, some of the other games might have cooler looking bosses, but in my opinion, the bosses here fit well within the game mechanically. None of them felt too fast or too slow, all of them fit in really well. And even the bosses that weren't super fun to fight never felt too annoying, and they still have an interesting design in terms of how they look. Some of my favorite bosses in the game were Nameless King, the Twin Princess, Champion Gundyr, and Gale, just to name a few. The story and lore also gets a 10 from me, because I think that it wraps up the entire story of the Dark Souls games in a good way. In total, Dark Souls 3 has a whopping 41 points out of 50, which is really impressive. Now here we are with Bloodborne. The art style and atmosphere gets a 10. While the other games are set in a dark fantasy medieval-like setting, Bloodborne takes place in a gothic Victorian-esque era. You don't see people walking around shooting magic out their hands, but there are some capable of using arcane, which seems more scientific rather than magic. The world looks really dark and again gothic, and blood seems to play a large role in the aesthetics. Instead of the knights wearing shiny armor, it's just hunters wearing free flowing light garments. The combat of the game is magnificent. First of all, you get a whole blicky, which can be used to parry certain enemies and bosses. You also have trick weapons. These weapons are able to transform into other weapons, and they even have their own unique combos, which I wish future Souls games implemented. I mean, it made the weapons feel super unique. Now I do have slight issues with this, and the issue is I just wish there were more weapons in the game. That's it. But the combat doesn't just stop there, as now the game prioritizes being fast and aggressive instead of passive, as you only have 2 shield options in the whole game, and they kinda suck, I'm not gonna lie. The game also has a rally mechanic, which means each time you take damage, you have a short window of opportunity to regain a small portion of health lost by attacking enemies successfully. The overall pacing of the combat just feels faster compared to the other traditional Souls games, and because of this, the combat gets a marvelous 9. Level design gets a 7, as it's linear without much interconnectivity just like Dark Souls 3, but that isn't really a bad thing. Bosses also gets a 7, since let's be honest, most of the base game ones are rather average. Like, there are a couple good ones, but I feel like most, apart from a few, aren't super fun to fight. The DLC does make up for this though, but in terms of visual design, they do look really cool. And finally, we have the story. I'm not gonna go over the full story of Bloodborne, as there are a lot of people who haven't played the game as yet, since just like Demon Souls, it's only available on PlayStation. At least, not for too long. Give it a couple more months. But the story starts with you being the hunter tasked to kill as many beasts as you can before daybreak. But there are some twists here and there which I'm not gonna go too deep into, but yeah, the story and the lore is amazing, and I'm gonna give it a 10. So in total, Bloodborne gets a magnificent 43 out of 50. At second place, we have Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. For some people, it's their favorite game of all time, and for me, it's my second favorite. But it's mostly because of one thing. Now, in terms of art style, the game gets a 9. It takes place in the late Sengoku era of Japan, and the visuals looks great. The combat gets a 10, and it's my favorite part of the game. Sekiro relies on deflection, which makes each encounter feels like a dance. You also get some cool prosthetic tools like the firecracker, which is used as a temporary distraction, the loaded umbrella, which helps with deflection, and the loaded axe, which is used for breaking shields. There are some other ones, but these stood out to me the most. You can also unlock cool abilities like the Mortal Jaw and Sakura Dance, to name a few. But man, the combat of this game is insanely good, and sure, it takes a while to get the hang of it, but it will click once you give it some time. Level design gets an 8 for me because it feels a bit more open, and using the grappling hook is really fun. The bosses gets a marvelous 9 because I mean, they feel well designed and complement the combat mechanics of Sekiro. Well, except for a few, but most are genuinely fun. Ishin and Genichiro being my favorites. The story is also pretty good. Again, not gonna spoil anything, but I would give it an 8. It's a more straightforward story compared to the rest of the games, but don't expect any Nier Automata level of plot twist and emotions. But it does its job pretty well, and combined with the lore, it does a good job of showing the world and characters of the game. Combining all the points together, Sekiro has an astonishing 44 out of 50. Now finally, at first place for the best Souls game, we have Elden Ring. Elden Ring's art design and atmosphere is one of my favorites in gaming, and because of this, it gets a 10. Just like the Dark Souls games, it takes place in a dark fantasy setting, however this time it's a bit more fantastical without going overboard. You see, the world is definitely brighter and more colorful, but it still has this dark twisted vibe going on, which I really love. Combat gets a 9. You see, Elden Ring has your traditional Souls type of combat, however it incorporates a lot of stuff from different Souls games, making it more fun. There's also a lot of weapons to choose from with a lot of different classes. Now I do wish some of the more basic moveset of the weapons were a bit more flashy, not like DMC level of flashiness, but you know, make them a bit more stylish. But again, Elden Ring gets a 9 for combat because of variety and smoothness. Level design gets a 10. I know some people don't like the open world, but me personally, I loved it. The world is open and has a lot of stuff within it, and that's crazy because it's not your typical RPG with markers placed all over the map with side quests to do. No, the world feels a bit more natural because of the random encounters with certain bosses or enemies, or caves or catacombs, which leads to good loot. Another thing I really loved about the level design is that sure, it's open world, but there are still legacy dungeons around, which has the typical style of level design and enemy placement similar to the previous Souls titles. Now let's move on to the bosses. They get an 8. In my opinion, the boss designs of Elden Ring looks way better than the ones in previous games. They even have some flashy movesets which complements their looks. However, what kept them from getting a 9 or 10 is the fact that oftentimes the bosses felt a bit too fast. And sure, bosses being faster than the player character is always a thing in the Souls games, but in Elden Ring, they have way too little downtime, and I guess it has to do with balancing because of summons, but yeah, I'd rather the next Souls entry not to include them if it means better balancing. Now finally, in terms of story and lore, Elden Ring gets a 10. The lore in this game is really deep. Everything from the bosses to even the basic enemies have a story behind them. Not gonna go too much into this as there are a lot of other YouTubers who've made excellent videos going over the story and lore, but again it gets a 10 because of how deep and interesting everything is. So in total, Elden Ring gets an astonishing 47 points out of 50. So that was the end of the video, and remember, this was just for fun, so please don't take it super serious. Also, if you like videos like these, be sure to like and subscribe. Also, shout out to my Patreon members on screen. Thank you guys for the support, and thank you all for watching this video. Have a good one.